For more than 2 decades, Benito Mussolini ruled Italy with a fascist regime that left the country in ruins. While his people suffered hunger, repression, and war, he maintained privileges alongside his lover, Clara Petacci. The distance between the leader and the population grew until it became unsustainable. In 1945, when defeat was inevitable, Mussolini tried to flee the country. He did not succeed. He was captured along with Petacci by the partisans in the north of Italy. There was no room for negotiations or for courts. The decision was swift, an immediate execution to put an end to the symbol of fascism. Why did the partisans choose a summary execution instead of a public trial? What did it mean for Italy that Petacci shared that ending? How was Mussolini's downfall recorded as one of the most brutal acts at the end of the war? The Black Roar, the birth of fascist power. Benito Amilcare Andrea Mussolini was born in July of 1883 in Predappio, a small town in the north of Italy located in the region of Emilia-Romagna. He came from a humble working-class home. His father, Alessandro, was a blacksmith and advocated radical socialist ideas inspired by figures like Karl Marx and Giuseppe Garibaldi. His mother, Rosa Maltoni, was a primary school teacher and practiced a strict Catholicism. From this combination emerged a decisive influence that shaped the young Benito, the political agitation inherited from his father and the authoritarian discipline transmitted by his mother. During his youth, Mussolini showed a violent and contentious temperament. He attended several Catholic schools, but was expelled on multiple occasions for aggressive behavior. On one occasion, he attacked a classmate with a knife, which led to his final expulsion from a Silesian boarding school. Despite this inclination towards confrontation, he demonstrated an ability for writing and public speaking, qualities that he would diligently cultivate and that would later become his main political tools. After completing studies that qualified him as a teacher, he briefly worked in rural schools, although he soon abandoned teaching to engage in activism. In 1902, he emigrated to Switzerland, thus avoiding compulsory military service. There, he joined circles of socialist and anarchist exiles, participated in demonstrations and strikes, and was arrested on several occasions by the Swiss police. During this time, he read carefully thinkers like Friedrich Nietzsche, Georges Sorel, and Vilfredo Pareto, whose theories on violence, direct action, and political elites profoundly influenced his thinking. He returned to Italy in 1904 to fulfill military service and, after that, intensified his political commitment through journalism. Starting in 1909, he collaborated with socialist newspapers in Trento, a territory then under Austro-Hungarian rule. His writings openly attacked the Habsburg monarchy, which led to imprisonments and expulsion from the region. In 1912, he was appointed director of the newspaper Avanti, the official organ of the Italian Socialist Party. From that position, he turned the newspaper into a powerful propaganda tool, advocating strikes, worker agitation, and an anti-militarist discourse. At that time, he was seen as one of the most promising leaders of Italian socialism. The outbreak of the First World War radically altered his trajectory. The Socialist Party maintained a neutralist position, but Mussolini broke with that line and advocated for Italy's intervention. He argued that the conflict could be transformed into a revolutionary and nationalist opportunity. In November of 1914, he was expelled from the party. He then founded the newspaper Il Popolo d'Italia, financed by Italian industrial sectors and by the French government, interested in dragging Italy into the war alongside the Entente. From its pages, he defended interventionism and nationalism. In 1915, Italy declared war on Austria-Hungary and Germany. Mussolini voluntarily enlisted and fought as a sergeant on the Alpine front. In 1917, he was injured in a mortar accident and was put out of service. The experience in the trenches reinforced his view of violence as an engine of social transformation and military discipline as the ideal model of political organization. With the armistice of 1918, Italy faced a deep crisis. The country had sacrificed resources and lives, but the peace treaties did not grant the promised territorial rewards, which led to the perception of an incomplete victory. Added to this were inflation, unemployment, and growing social unrest. Between 1919 and 1920, the so-called Red Biennium was experienced, marked by general strikes, factory occupations, and peasant uprisings inspired by the Russian Revolution. The economic elites feared a collapse of the liberal order. It was in this climate where Mussolini founded the Italian Fasci of Combat in March of 1919. The movement brought together ex-combatants, radical nationalists, and sectors disillusioned with parliamentarism. Its program was ambiguous, with seemingly progressive social proposals mixed with an ultra-nationalist discourse. The group's hallmark was the systematic use of political violence. Its militants, known as Black Shirts because of their uniform, launched attacks against unions, cooperatives, and socialist headquarters. And these actions had tolerance and even support from local authorities and business people. In the elections of 1919, the movement achieved insignificant results. However, the context of violence and the weakness of the liberal government allowed Mussolini to grow politically. In 1921, he reorganized the Fasci into the National Fascist Party, and that same year he was elected deputy. The alliance with liberals and conservatives gave him parliamentary legitimacy, while the Black Shirts continued to weaken his adversaries in the streets. The decisive moment came in October of 1922. After weeks of unrest and strikes, the fascists planned the March on Rome as a show of strength. Although the mobilized columns were small and poorly armed, the political context favored the maneuver. The government of Luigi Factor asked King Victor Emmanuel III to declare a state of siege, but the monarch refused, fearing a civil war and the disloyalty of the army. On October 29th, the king commissioned Mussolini to form a new government. The fascist leader arrived in the capital by train and was appointed prime minister at 39 years of age. From then on, he began a gradual process of concentration of power. At first, he maintained a parliamentary facade, but after the murder of Deputy Giacomo Matteotti in 1924, a crime linked to fascist militants, he decided to move towards open dictatorship. In January of 1925, he officially proclaimed the fascist regime. From that moment, he consolidated his figure as Il Duce. He banned opposition parties, limited freedom of the press, established widespread censorship, and strengthened the repressive apparatus through the Organization for the Surveillance and Repression of Anti-Fascism. He dismantled democratic institutions and established a single-party system. The propaganda constantly exalted his image while promoting large public works and social mobilization campaigns. Fascism was presented as a radical alternative to liberalism and socialism, based on extreme nationalism, discipline, and subordination to the state. In less than 1 decade, Mussolini had gone from marginalized socialist agitator to absolute dictator of Italy. His rise was the result of organized violence, alliances with powerful sectors, and the manipulation of social discontent that followed the Great War. Forbidden Desire, Clara Petacci with the Dictator. Clara Petacci was born in Rome in February of 1912 into a well-to-do family with strong Catholic convictions. Her father, Francesco Saverio Petacci, worked as a doctor linked to the Vatican City, which granted his family a distinguished social position and privileged access to ecclesiastical circles. Her mother, Giuseppina Persichetti, also came from a conservative bourgeois background. Clara grew up surrounded by discipline, thorough education, and material stability, conditions that allowed her to integrate naturally into the cultural and social spaces of the Roman upper middle class. From an early age, she showed a marked inclination towards religiosity and obedience, at a time when Italy was experiencing rapid political and social changes following the consolidation of the fascist regime. During adolescence, Clara developed an intense admiration for Benito Mussolini, whose figure was omnipresent in official propaganda. The Duce appeared daily in newspapers, newsreels, and posters, projected as a symbol of national strength and undisputed leader. Despite her youth, Clara began to write him fervent letters, expressing absolute devotion. When in 1926 Mussolini survived an assassination attempt in Rome, Clara, at just 14 years old, wrote a missive in which she expressed her wish to have been present to protect him. This episode reveals that from a very early age, she perceived the fascist leader not only as a political reference, but as an idealized personal figure. The first direct contact occurred in 1932. Clara was traveling with her mother and her sister to the coast of Ostia when she recognized Mussolini himself at the wheel of a red sports car. She followed him to the beach and managed to exchange a few words with him. That casual encounter soon developed into a closer relationship. A few weeks later, Clara was received at the Palazzo Venezia, the seat of the fascist government in Rome, where the dictator held audiences and from whose balcony he delivered mass speeches. What had begun as an impulsive gesture ended up becoming a bond that continued to deepen. In 1934, she married Riccardo Federici, an officer of the military aeronautics. The union was brief and conflictive, largely because the relationship with Mussolini already existed in parallel and was becoming increasingly close. In 1936, with the marriage separation consummated, Clara became the recognized mistress of the dictator in the midst of the Italian imperialist expansion in Africa and rapprochement with Germany. From then on, she remained by his side until the final collapse of the regime in 1945. The connection with Mussolini granted Clara and her family tangible privileges. Her father received promotions and professional advantages, securing contracts and influential patients thanks to the closeness with the regime. Her brother Marcello participated in state-favored businesses, shielded from uncomfortable investigations. Her sister Miriam found access to the national film industry, controlled by the fascist cultural machinery. Clara, for her part, obtained residences, luxury cars, and a generous allowance that allowed her to maintain an ostentatious lifestyle. The accumulation of benefits around the Petacci family eventually became a visible example of the excesses of fascist power and fueled social resentment that spread during the war years. The relationship, however, was not limited to material advantages. Mussolini found in Clara a constant, intimate refuge. Unlike other occasional relationships, he found stability and daily companionship in her. The private correspondence shows that he turned to Clara to express weariness, frustrations, and personal complaints that he shared neither with his wife, Rachele Guidi, nor with his closest collaborators. The communication between them was continuous, with daily calls even in the middle of official meetings. Clara represented for him a permanent emotional support and offered him unwavering loyalty in all stages of his political life. Although her role was not institutional, Clara's presence influenced the dictator's intimate environment. There is no documented evidence of her participation in military decisions or strategic debates, but her daily closeness indicated to what extent fascist power was surrounded by favoritism and family privileges. On a symbolic level, Clara embodied the excesses of a regime that used state resources to satisfy private interests and protect close circles. The public projection of the relationship was managed with discretion. Mussolini maintained his formal marriage with Rachele Guidi, and official propaganda promoted the image of a traditional family, a model for Italian society. However, among the ruling class and social circles in Rome, it was known that Clara played the role of the dictator's romantic companion. The visible benefits granted to her family eventually filtered into public opinion, consolidating the perception that she was an obvious symbol of fascist corruption. With the collapse of the regime in September of 1943 and the creation of the Italian Social Republic in the north under German occupation, Clara remained faithfully by the Duce's side. As political and military structures crumbled and former allies fled or distanced themselves, she accompanied him in his movements and in his moments of greatest vulnerability. The physical deterioration of the leader and the loss of power did not alter her decision to remain by his side. In April of 1945, when the Allied troops advanced and the Italian partisans reclaimed territory, Mussolini tried to flee to Switzerland with a convoy of German officials and soldiers. Clara insisted on traveling with him. rejecting warnings from family and friends who asked her to save herself separately. Her determination to share the dictator's fate was absolute and marked the final events. Clara Petacci's life journey illustrates how a personal relationship could become an inseparable element of a regime's political life. What began as adolescent admiration turned into constant, intimate companionship, with direct implications for the social ascent of her entire family and the public image of fascism. Her presence alongside Mussolini, both in the years of greatest power and in decline, made her an involuntary protagonist of one of the most remembered episodes in contemporary Italian history. The fall of the Colossus, the regime crumbles. The fascist regime of Benito Mussolini began to show clear signs of wear and tear towards the end of the 1930s, a weakening that intensified with Italy's entry into the Second World War. The expansive foreign policy, conceived to project Italy as a Mediterranean power, ended up exposing the structural fragilities of the system. The military campaigns undertaken under the direction of the Duce resulted in repeated defeats that, when accumulated, accelerated the internal political collapse of the fascist state. In the summer of 1940, Mussolini decided to intervene in the global conflict on the side of Germany, convinced that the war would be brief and that Italy could gain territorial benefits with a limited effort. The first offensive in Greece, launched from Albania in October of that year, revealed the opposite. The Italian forces were repelled by the Greek army and retreated towards Albanian territory. The inability to sustain the operation became evident until, months later, German troops intervened directly and occupied Greece. The episode showed the logistical and organizational weakness of the Italian armed forces. In northern Africa, the situation was not better. In September of 1940, Italian troops invaded Egypt from Libya, but were soon defeated by the British Army, which captured an enormous number of prisoners. The arrival of the German Afrika Korps, under the command of Erwin Rommel, temporarily relieved the situation, although at the price of confirming Italy's total dependence on Germany to sustain the war. The definitive defeat came at the Battle of El Alamein in 1942, followed by a general retreat to Tunisia and the surrender of Axis forces in northern Africa. On the Eastern Front, Italy sent a contingent that ended up facing devastating losses. The Expeditionary Corps in the Soviet Union, later expanded to a full army, was annihilated during the winter of 1942-43 in the fighting associated with the Battle of Stalingrad and the retreat from the Don River. More than half of the Italian soldiers deployed were killed, went missing, or were captured. The impact of those losses on national morale was profound and further undermined the legitimacy of the regime. Meanwhile, the home front was deteriorating without pause. The economy, fragile since before the war, collapsed under the weight of the prolonged war effort. Allied bombings destroyed industrial and port facilities, severely affecting productive capacity and causing civilian casualties in the main cities. The shortage of food and fuels became chronic, and discontent spread both among the population and within the fascist party, the armed forces, and the monarchy itself. The Allied landing in Sicily in July of 1943 marked the final blow. The operation began on the 9th of July with a massive deployment of British and American troops. The Italian defense was weak, and in many places the population received the invaders as liberators. Palermo fell on the 22nd of July, confirming the regime's inability to defend the national territory. Faced with the imminence of a total collapse, internal political maneuvers accelerated. On the 24th of July, the Grand Fascist Council met in Rome. For the first time in 2 decades, the party's highest body openly questioned Mussolini. Dino Grandi, veteran leader and diplomat, presented a motion that returned supreme control of the armed forces to King Victor Emmanuel III. The vote was favorable to the proposal, which implied a direct rejection of the Duce's personal authority. On the 25th of July, Mussolini went to the royal palace to inform the king. Victor Emmanuel received him coldly and communicated his immediate dismissal. In his place, Marshal Pietro Badoglio was appointed. Upon leaving the palace, Mussolini was arrested by the Carabinieri and transferred under military custody to a secret location. The new government of Badoglio began negotiations with the Allies and signed an armistice that was publicly announced on the 8th of September of 1943. Italy formally exited the war against them, but the country was plunged into chaos. The German troops, prepared in advance, quickly occupied much of the territory, disarmed the Italian army, and established direct control over the strategic regions. Mussolini, still a prisoner, was transferred several times until finally being held at the Hotel Campo Imperatore in the Gran Sasso Massif. On the 12th of September, German commandos under the command of Otto Skorzeny executed Operation Oak. Using gliders, they landed next to the hotel, surprised the Italian guard, and freed Mussolini without shots. The dictator was taken to Germany, where he met with Hitler. The German leader convinced him to return to Italy to lead a new state in the north under German tutelage. On the 23rd of September, 1943, the creation of the Italian Social Republic was officially announced, with its headquarters in Salo on the shores of Lake Garda. This regime functioned in practice as a puppet state without real sovereignty. Fascist institutions were reconstructed on paper, but all important decisions depended on the German commanders. The Republic of Salo was characterized by repression and political violence. The fascist militia was reorganized with German weaponry, and special courts were established to punish opponents and deserters. One of the most notorious trials was that of Galeazzo Ciano, former Minister of Foreign Affairs and son-in-law of Mussolini, executed by firing squad in January of 1944 after voting against the Duce in the Grand Council. The foundation of this regime was exclusively the German military presence and the repressive apparatus, without genuine popular support. In this final period, Mussolini showed a profound physical and mental deterioration. He looked like an aged man with grey hair and tired gestures. His decision-making capacity was reduced, and in meetings with Hitler he appeared subordinate, without initiative, and lacking the energy that had characterized him in the years of consolidation. Surrounded by distrust and aware of the inevitable defeat, he became the nominal head of a decaying state, sustained only by the German occupying force. Path of no return, the escape to the border. In April of 1945, the so-called Italian Social Republic was in a state of definitive collapse. The Northern Front had collapsed under the constant pressure of the Allied offensive and the sustained advance of the partisan formations, which controlled much of the territory. Military communications were systematically interrupted, fascist garrisons crumbled daily, and the civilian population expressed open rejection of the regime in all the liberated cities. In Milan, an industrial center and symbol of Republican power, a general insurrection occurred on the 25th of April. The National Liberation Committee proclaimed the popular uprising, took control of the city, and decreed the unconditional surrender of the fascist forces, as well as the death penalty for the main leaders of the Salo regime. Mussolini remained in Milan during those days, settled in the prefecture, and trying to sustain a resistance that in practice had disappeared. That very same 25th of April, he met at the Archbishop's residence with representatives of the National Liberation Committee in the presence of Cardinal Alfredo Ildefonso Schuster, who was trying to mediate to avoid a bloodbath in the city. The resistance delegates presented him with a clear demand: full surrender and his immediate submission. Mussolini firmly rejected the proposal, still convinced that he could negotiate with the German commanders or reach Swiss territory to reorganize from exile. The meeting ended without an agreement and in an evident climate of tension. Hours later, he left Milan, accompanied by Clara Petacci and a small group of dignitaries who remained loyal to the regime. The decision was to head for the northern border, following the route along Lake Como with the hope of reaching Swiss soil before the partisans closed the passes. There were no guarantees of asylum in Bern, but Mussolini hoped to obtain some form of political internment that would allow him to survive. He was accompanied by ministers and high officials, among them Alessandro Pavolini, secretary of the Republican Fascist Party, along with members of the hierarchy seeking to escape. The caravan was organized into a convoy of military vehicles in which Italian fascists and retreating German troops were mixed together. Mussolini's personal image during this escape contrasted radically with the imposing figure he had projected for years. He wore a Luftwaffe officer's coat and a German steel helmet with the intention of going unnoticed among the soldiers. His face was swollen and pale, his hair graying, and his movements revealed exhaustion. Those who witnessed those moments described him as a man defeated, without energy or hope, aware that his fate was practically sealed. The military disguise attempted to hide him, but his characteristic features remained visible and his attitude conveyed resignation. The convoy departed from Milan heading to Como, following the road that bordered the western shore of the lake. On April 26, they advanced slowly between improvised checkpoints and constant rumors of nearby battles. The discipline among the German soldiers was crumbling. Most thought only of avoiding capture and showed clear signs of demoralization. That night, the column spent the night in Como, while news from the front confirmed the unstoppable advance of the resistance. The morning of the 27th of April, the convoy reached the town of Dongo, located on the shores of Lake Como, at some distance from the border. There it encountered a checkpoint established by the 52nd Garibaldi Brigade, a communist partisan formation under the command of Pier Luigi Bellini delle Stelle and Urbano Lazzaro. The partisans had strategically secured the access points to intercept the fascist hierarchs attempting to flee to Switzerland. The fighters forced the column to stop. The Germans, aware of their inability to break through, surrendered their weapons and negotiated with the partisans. The condition was unequivocal. The German soldiers could continue heading north, but they had to hand over the fascist leaders traveling in the convoy. The partisans proceeded to identify the civilian occupants one by one, using lists and photographs of the most wanted. Among them appeared several high-ranking officials of the Italian Social Republic, recognized immediately. Mussolini remained hidden inside a military truck with his helmet on and his coat buttoned, avoiding raising his gaze. It was Urbano Lazzaro who noticed his presence. He observed the demeanor of an alleged German soldier, short in stature and broad in build, who avoided eye contact. The man's appearance was rigid, with the dull expression of someone exhausted. Lazzaro asked him to remove his helmet, and at that moment, the identity was undeniable. It was Benito Mussolini. The discovery caused an immediate reaction among the fighters, aware that they had before them the main person responsible for Italian fascism. Mussolini offered no resistance when identified. His silence and passivity contrasted with images from the years of power, when he appeared energetic and gesticulating before crowds. He was taken under armed guard to a house in Dongo, and then moved to another house in the neighboring town of Bonzanigo for greater security. The news of his capture was quickly communicated to the upper structures of the National Liberation Committee via clandestine radio. The message spread across the resistance units throughout the northern region and generated immediate debate about his fate. Some demanded immediate execution as an act of summary justice, while others defended the possibility of handing him over to the Allies for a formal trial. Clara Petacci, detained along with the rest of the civilians from the convoy, requested to remain with Mussolini. The partisan commanders discussed her request and finally accepted it, a decision that definitively tied her to the dictator's fate. In those final hours, her absolute loyalty was confirmed, and her figure became inseparably linked to the events that would unfold in the following days. The House of Silence, last night of the Duce. After his capture in Dongo on the 27th of April of 1945, Benito Mussolini was transferred under heavy guard to the village of Bonzanigo, a small hamlet in the municipality of Mezzegra, along the tranquil waters of Lake Como. The choice of this location was not accidental. The partisans of the 52 Garibaldi Brigade needed a location that combined discretion with ease of control. Bonzanigo offered those conditions. A rural nucleus away from the main road with stone constructions that could be secured without deploying a large number of men. The designated dwelling was a modest farmhouse with thick walls and simple rooms, typical of the Lombardy region. Turned suddenly into a prison, it became the scene of the former dictator's final hours. Mussolini arrived escorted by armed fighters, accompanied by Clara Petacci, who had insisted emphatically on staying with him since the capture. The young woman refused to separate, even though some partisan leaders preferred to keep her in custody in a different place. After internal discussions, it was decided to keep them together, a decision made both for practical surveillance reasons and because her presence did not represent a direct military risk. The couple was placed in a room on the ground floor, permanently guarded by guards who relieved each other in short shifts to ensure constant alertness. The testimonies of those who stood guard that night agree on the same portrait. Mussolini appeared physically and mentally defeated. He walked hunched over, spoke barely, and spent long moments sitting in silence, staring at the ground. His behavior conveyed absolute dejection. He did not attempt to escape, did not give speeches, nor did he show any will to resist. His passivity was difficult to reconcile with the image of a combative leader who for more than 20 years had dominated Italian politics. Clara, on the other hand, was active, cried frequently, and made constant pleas to the partisans. She asked for clemency, defended the Duce's legitimacy, and assured that history would vindicate him. For the guards, her pleas were ineffective, although they tolerated her insistence as an inevitable part of the custody. Meanwhile, in Milan and in other cities in the north, the leadership of the National Liberation Committee of Upper Italy debated intensely the fate of the prisoner. Opposing positions circulated via clandestine radio. One faction proposed a public trial, with a documented process to show the world the new Italy's ability to submit even a dictator to legal proceedings. Another faction, more radical and majority among the communist cadres and among leaders who had suffered fascist repression, advocated for immediate execution. Their arguments were clear. Keeping Mussolini alive meant risking a German rescue attempt or the pressure from the Allies to hand him over to international courts. The risk of rescue was taken very seriously. The precedent of Gran Sasso in September of 1943 was still fresh in everyone's memory. On that occasion, German commandos had freed the dictator with surprising efficiency. Now, with armed columns of the Reich still present in the region, the danger of a similar operation was real. The reports reaching the resistance commanders spoke of German units in retreat, among them SS detachments maintaining strict discipline. No one doubted that these contingents could attempt a desperate action. The resistance commanders understood that they could not repeat the mistake of underestimating the enemy. Throughout the entire night, from the 27th to the 28th of April, meetings and communications among the commanders took place. The atmosphere was one of urgency and tension. With each new report of German movements, the stance in favor of immediate execution gained weight. Among the leaders who supported this option was Sandro Pertini, a historical socialist and prominent figure of the National Liberation Committee. That same night, from Radio Milano Libertà, he delivered a message stating unequivocally that Mussolini had to be shot. The tone of the broadcast left no doubt about the definitive orientation of the decision. In the house of Bonzanigo, Mussolini and Clara were unaware of the extent of these deliberations. The prisoner remained withdrawn, ate little, and lit cigarettes that he extinguished without finishing them, in a repetitive gesture that the guards interpreted as a sign of anxiety. Clara frequently interrupted the partisans' conversations, imploring for a different treatment for the dictator. Her words had no effect, but they demonstrated her determination to accompany him to the end. The uncertainty reached even the base fighters. Not everyone knew the decision of the superior command, and among the shifts, contradictory rumors circulated. Some believed that Mussolini would be transferred to Milan to face a people's court. Others assured that the execution order had already been signed. That lack of information generated an atmosphere of tense expectation inside the house. The doors remained locked, the hallways watched by young armed fighters, and the silence was only interrupted by conversations in a low voice. Under those conditions, Mussolini, who in other times had spoken before crowds from the balcony of Piazza Venezia, waited without knowing his fate. Reduced to a prisoner under the custody of armed peasants and workers, he was completely stripped of the power he had wielded with an iron hand. The woman who accompanied him reinforced the paradox. While the regime was collapsing, she maintained her absolute loyalty, linking herself definitively to the outcome that was approaching. At dawn on April 28th, the decision had already been made and communicated from Milan. The National Liberation Committee transmitted precise orders to the units in the region. In Bonzanigo, the guards received the instruction to prepare the immediate transfer of the prisoners to the place where the execution would take place. Sentence of lead shots in Mezzegra. On the morning of the 28th of April 1945, Benito Mussolini was still in custody at the farmhouse in Bonzanigo, guarded by the 52 Garibaldi Brigade. By mid-morning, Walter Audicio arrived, known among the partisans by his war name Colonel Valerio. He was an experienced communist leader with years of combat in resistance formations in northern Italy and a reputation for strict discipline. He carried a clear order issued directly by the National Liberation Committee of Upper Italy after nocturnal deliberations to immediately execute Mussolini and Clara Petacci, without allowing delays or judicial proceedings that could hinder the operation. Audicio later recounted that he carried with him the precise instruction to eliminate the dictator through a quick execution by firing squad. In his memoirs and subsequent statements, he offered several versions of the episode, with different nuances depending on the political context in which he related them. This lack of uniformity in his testimony fueled historiographical debates about the exact sequence, although the essential fact remains undisputed. The execution took place that day and was personally directed by him. Around noon, Mussolini and Petacci were transported in a requisitioned car, a red Alfa Romeo, escorted by fighters armed with submachine guns and pistols. The journey between Bonzanigo and Giulino di Mezzegra was brief, just a few kilometers skirting the provincial road that runs alongside the lake. The final destination was Villa Belmonte, a private residence located on the outskirts, recognizable by its wrought iron gate and stone wall. The partisans had chosen this point for tactical reasons. It was a secluded section, protected by dense vegetation, where the shots could go unnoticed, and where it was possible to execute the order quickly, reducing the risk of intervention by retreating German troops. The versions of what happened in Giulino differ in important details. According to Audicio himself, upon arriving in front of the villa, he ordered Mussolini and Clara to get out of the vehicle, placed them in front of the wall, and announced the sentence in the name of the Italian people. He claimed to have used a French MAS 38 submachine gun of 9mm caliber, a weapon captured from enemy units with which he opened fire at close range. In other reconstructions, Audicio noted that before shooting, he read a formal sentence listing Mussolini's crimes during the fascist regime and his responsibility in the war. According to this version, the dictator would have responded with a brief phrase, "Aim at the heart." After those words, Audicio would have fired the final burst. An alternative variant holds that there was no reading of the sentence or verbal exchange. According to that account, Clara allegedly lunged at Mussolini in an instinctive attempt to protect him at the moment Audicio raised the weapon, embracing him in the seconds before the volley. The bullet struck both simultaneously, causing the immediate death of Petacci alongside the dictator. The partisan Aldo Lampredi, who accompanied Audicio in the operation, left a less elaborate testimony. According to his account, the order was executed without speeches or formalities. The car stopped, the prisoners were made to get out, and shooting proceeded. This version coincides with Audicio on the essentials, although it omits dramatic elements like Mussolini's supposed phrase or Clara's gesture. The autopsy conducted at the Institute of Legal Medicine of Milan on the 30th of April of 1945 confirmed that Mussolini received at least 9 bullet impacts, 4 of them in the thoracic area, consistent with short-range shots from an automatic weapon. Clara had several projectiles in the abdomen and chest, enough to cause immediate death by hemorrhage, The medical reports show that both were hit at the same time and that they died instantly without the possibility of assistance. There are doubts about whether additional weapons were used besides the MAS-38. Some later witnesses claimed that after the first burst, pistols were fired to ensure the result. The existence of more impacts than would correspond to a brief burst fuels this hypothesis, although ballistic evidence does not allow it to be conclusively established. The rapidity of the operation, followed immediately by the transfer of the bodies to Milan, favored the emergence of alternative theories in the years after. Some authors suggested that Mussolini might have been executed in a different place and that his death was later staged in Giuliano. Others suggested that the person responsible was not Audicio, but some other partisan. None of these hypotheses have been confirmed with solid documentary evidence, and the majority of historiography agrees that the execution took place in front of the gate of Villa Belmonte during the afternoon of the 28th of April. Once the download was completed, the partisans checked the death of the prisoners, placed the bloodied bodies in the car, and began the return. The transfer was destined for Milan, where the resistance authorities had decided to publicly display the corpses. With this, they sought to show the population that the fascist regime had come to an end irreversibly and that the main person responsible could no longer exert power or become a symbol of resistance. The execution in Giuliano di Mezzegra represented the culmination of a chain of decisions initiated the previous night in Bonzanigo and in the meetings of the National Liberation Committee in Milan. It was a measure conceived as an act of military urgency in the context of the war still in progress. It was not a judicial process nor a formal trial, but a summary execution intended to immediately eliminate any risk of rescue or political use of Mussolini's figure. Clara Petacci, by remaining with him until the last moment, became inseparably linked to this outcome, becoming a direct victim of the same decision that sought to decisively close the fascist experience in Italy. The Square of the Dead spectre of the hanged fascism. After the execution in Giuliano di Mezzegra, the partisans acted with military speed. The bodies of Benito Mussolini and Clara Petacci were placed back in the car that had driven them to the execution site, along with the corpses of fascist leaders executed in other simultaneous operations. The convoy left for Milan at dawn on the 29th of April of 1945, passing through towns where the news of the dictator's death was already circulating through rumors spread by word of mouth. The certainty that the Duce had fallen spread among civilians, combatants and locals even before the remains arrived in the Lombard capital. In the early hours of the morning, the partisans decided to take the bodies to Piazzale Loreto, a place full of symbolism. There, in August of 1944, 15 resistance fighters had been publicly executed by German order, and their bodies displayed as a warning. Choosing the same space to now exhibit Mussolini and his collaborators represented a deliberate historical reversal. The site of the resistance's humiliation was transformed into a setting of symbolic revenge against those responsible for fascism. At dawn, the corpses were laid upon the dusty ground of the square. In a few minutes, neighbors and passers-by began to gather. The crowd grew quickly until it numbered hundreds of people who hurled insults, blows and spits upon the inert bodies. Mussolini's figure was the main target of the accumulated anger, but Clara Petacci, despite not having held a political position, suffered identical treatment due to her closeness to the dictator and the perception that she symbolized the regime's corruption. Photographs captured by Allied correspondents and by civilians show scenes of collective violence. Stones thrown against bodies, shots fired at point-blank range on already mutilated corpses, and relentless kicking. Mussolini's face became progressively disfigured. These images circulated immediately in the international press and became iconic documents of the collapse of fascism. To prevent the crowd from completely destroying the remains, the partisans decided to hang them on the metal structure of a gasoline station located at the corner of the square. With hooks and ropes, they tied the feet of Mussolini, Petacci and other hierarchs, suspending them in an inverted position. This gesture protected the bodies from direct manipulation and at the same time displayed them visibly to all those present. The symbolism was evident. He who had dominated Italy from high balconies now appeared hanging upside down as human wreckage before the people. The memory of the 15 executed the previous year turned Piazzale Loreto into a space of inverted memory. Relatives of the victims came to witness the public degradation of those who had supported the regime. For the local population, the scene represented retributive justice. For foreign observers, the spectacle was excessive. The reaction of Winston Churchill, later recorded in his memoirs, reflected that ambivalence. He found the execution understandable in the war context, but judged the subsequent outrage as politically counterproductive. The news also reached Berlin. Adolf Hitler was informed on the 29th of April, one day before his suicide. Upon learning the fate of Mussolini and Petacci, he reaffirmed his decision to order the immediate cremation of his own remains after death, with the purpose of preventing his body from being exposed to public ridicule, as had happened in Milan. After several hours of display, United States forces, already present as the military authority in the city, ordered the removal of the bodies. They were transferred to the Institute of Forensic Medicine, where autopsies were performed. In the case of Mussolini, the report confirmed multiple impacts to the chest, consistent with the execution in Giuliano. Subsequently, the body was buried anonymously in the Greater Cemetery of Milan, under a registration number intended to prevent political pilgrimages. However, in 1946, a group of neo-fascist militants managed to clandestinely exhume the corpse and hide it for several months in different localities. The episode, known as the theft of the corpse, forced the government to recover it through intelligence operations. Once recovered, the body was secretly deposited in the Capuchin convent of Cerro Maggiore, where it remained in absolute secrecy for more than a decade. In 1957, after years of family pressures and political debates, the government authorized the delivery of the remains to the Mussolinis. The dictator was finally buried in the family crypt of Predappio, his hometown in Emilia-Romagna. Since then, the tomb has become a place of pilgrimage for neo-fascist sympathizers and the curious, especially on notable dates such as the March on Rome or the anniversary of his death. Predappio acquired an ambiguous role in the Italian memory. For some, it was an anachronistic place of worship. For others, an uncomfortable reminder of the persistence of the fascist myth. Over the decades, authorities debated the possibility of restricting access or turning the locality into a center of critical studies. None of these proposals stopped the flow of visitors, and Predappio was marked as a symbolic place of the dictator's heritage and the conflicted memory of fascism in Republican Italy.